Right. Mark September 18th on your calendar. Certainly Donald Trump and the people around him have, as Judge Wisenberg in that hush money case, the sentencing is set for that date. So there is the distinct possibility Donald Trump could be serving time in jail. We don't know how much time, if it comes to pass at all, if it would come before the election. He wants to put this off until at least after the election. Saul Wisenberg, the former deputy independent counsel, Fox News contributor. Saul, great to have you. What are the odds of Donald Trump being sentenced to prison?
Well, I can't give you the exact odds with this particular judge, Neil. It's certainly possible, and it's outrageous that he did not continue the sentencing date given the issues involved with immunity. But I can tell you this: if he does sentence former President Trump to time, if the judge follows the law, Trump will be out on bond pending appeal, because there are very important immunity-related issues that have to be litigated post-trial.
Now, the judge says he's not influenced by political considerations. So, having said that, I don't know which way it cuts. If he sends, the former president to jail, and as you said, you raised this issue with bond and making it go away on the former president's part, but it would actually potentially help Donald Trump and garner sympathy and attention to him. So it kind of seems to cut both ways, doesn't it?
I absolutely believe you're right. We have seen what the effect was of the 4 indictments. It had actually, as you know, an energizing effect on the former president in terms of campaign contributions and poll rankings. And so I think there would be a terrible reaction to this. And I think it's probably more likely that that he will allow him, Judge Merchan will allow former President Trump to be out on bail. It would be an incredibly lawless decision for him to order, to both impose a prison sentence and order him to go to jail. It would certainly, even in New York State, be overruled pretty quickly. Again, Alvin Bragg did not need to have this problem. He did not have to put former presidential advisors on the stand. But that created an immunity issue, an issue of presidential immunity that can't be ignored in light of the Supreme Court opinion. And I'll tell you something else. Trump's lawyers asked to litigate these immunity issues pre-trial because they knew there were going to be an issue. And at Bragg's urging, Judge Merchan refused to do that. So this is all of his own making. And finally, I want to point out there is absolutely no law enforcement reason for Trump to be sentenced on September 16th. It's obviously a political decision in an attempt to influence the presidential campaign. These are important immunity-related issues that need to be litigated post-trial here because they weren't done pre-trial.
So what is a middle ground on this? If the bail is accepted and you push this off, would the judge be indicating what the sentencing would be on September 18th, even though it might not come into effect till after the election? Then all bets are off after the election, assuming in this case Donald Trump is elected president again. Then, of course, it potentially goes away, but I don't know about that. But would the judge then likely give a sentence, his idea of the sentence, say not imposable until after the election?
Well, first of all, we know what he's going to rule. We think we know what he's going to rule on the immunity issue because he told everybody, I'm going to rule on immunity 2 days before the sentencing. So if he was going to toss the case or send it back at least for retrial based on the presidential immunity argument, I don't think he would have done that. So I think he's going to reject the immunity arguments. I think he's going to impose sentence on the 18th, you said, and I think because they want it to be something that can be talked about during the campaign and during the early voting period. You're right. I believe if a sentence, there is no way if Trump is elected and serving as president that he's going to be doing any time while he is president. I can assure you of that.
Well, that was my next idiotic question, and you're very patient with all of them. But so that if he is sentenced, and he does win back the presidency, he could make this go away, right? Or can he make it go away only when he is inaugurated as president, not merely because he was elected president?
Well, it's not so much that, first of all, it's a state issue. He can't
Right,
pardon
right.
himself for a state crime. We don't even know if he can pardon himself for a federal crime. If there is a sentence that is yet to be imposed when he becomes president, in that event, it's not so much that Trump can make it go away. It's the operation of federal constitutional law that will make it go away. I can't believe there's any federal court in the country, particularly given the Supreme Court's opinions in this area of executive power. They are not going to impose a prison sentence on a sitting president, even for something that was done before he was president. That would have to wait until his term was over. But the whole thing is, we can't get lost in the lost in the forest because we're looking at the trees, because this was clearly. Right. This New York State prosecution was clearly a political prosecution from the get-go. So
very quickly then, flip it around, Donald Trump loses the election. The protections or the sort of shield that he sought and his lawyers sought, that goes away as well, right?
But because of Alvin Bragg, not necessarily entirely in this case, because he put those presidential advisors on the stand in that state trial. And they testified about conversations that they had with Trump. And under the Supreme Court's opinion, those are presumptively privileged conversations. And so the question would be, how much did this affect the verdict in the New York case? And the prosecutors talked about those presidential advisors in the closing argument, and they said it was devastating. So stay tuned.
All right. Got it. Saul, thank you so much. Always good catching up with you. Saul Wisenberg, the former Deputy Independent Counsel. We will be watching that very closely the closer we get to September 18th.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.